Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this session on U.S. competitiveness and advice to the next president, or to the new president. Before we start, we have this high-tech revolution going on, and as part of that, we are working in this session with Facebook and can pose a question and get responses from Facebook participants about their answer to the question. And so I'd like to pose a question now for anybody who'd like to answer it on Facebook. And the question is as follows. Right now, the U.S. is discussing a gigantic stimulus package to try to restore economic growth and prosperity in the country. Is the package on target? Is it addressing the fundamental issues that we need to address at this moment in U.S. history? So those of you that are interested or listening on Facebook, answer that question, and we'll see the tabulation a little bit later as we go forward. The genesis of this session was the fact that virtually every country in the world now is really preoccupied with the economic crisis, which is severe to say the least. And the U.S. is no exception. Every country, or most countries, are thinking about or already started implementing significant stimulus packages to try to jumpstart the economy. There's various ways of describing it. But the idea is that we need to invest at this time substantial amounts of money in really getting our economies moving again. And, of course, nowhere is that more important in the U.S. The U.S. has been really the engine of growth in the world economy for many decades, and the problems in the U.S. have now started to drag down many other countries. But the question we'd like to talk about in this session is actually how do we address the current economic crisis in a way that actually advances the long-term competitiveness of the country, rather than just, spends money that's ultimately not productive or actually even makes the problem worse in the long run. And I think the reason that this is an important question is that the U.S. for the last 5 or 10 years, or maybe more, has really not had a clear strategy for advancing the competitiveness of the country. There's been no really articulated set of priorities that we need to be addressing in the United States, and at least one observer, that is me, would say that we really haven't been making much progress on many of the most important challenges facing the country. So the question is, how do we invest this money now in order to get the best possible result, really for the fundamental progress of the United States? And again, in each in their own way, every country basically has this challenge. How do we address the short term in a way that really advances the long term? Now, in order to address that question, we have here a panel of really distinguished private sector leaders. And the reason this panel has been assembled is because these are the folks that are actually on the firing line trying to compete. And so I think it's very important for the U.S. president to have the thinking about what to do now really grounded in the private sector. Very briefly, I just want to introduce them. Ellen Kullman, who's now the President and Chief Executive Officer of DuPont. All of us know DuPont as one of the nation's great technology companies. Duncan Niederauer, Chief Executive Officer of the New York Stock Exchange Euronext, in the middle of the firestorm in our financial markets. Rupert Murdoch, known to all of us, Chairman and Chief Executive of News Corporation, really an acute observer of both the U.S. and the world economy. David Rubenstein, co-founder and managing director of the Carlyle Group, one of the leading private equity firms in the world, works with dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of companies, struggling with how to compete and how to create value. And finally, and last but not least, Ron Williams. Ron is CEO and chairman of Aetna, one of the nation's leading health insurers, but also really very much in tune with the pulse of citizens all across the country. So in order to start, I'd like to ask the panel to reflect a little bit on the question of what are the fundamental challenges facing the United States. Let's understand what those look like, and then we can turn to the question of is this stimulus really moving us in the right direction. And I'd like to ask Ron Williams to start. Ron, how would you answer that question? What are the fundamental questions that we have to address in the United States if we're going to be prosperous in the long run?
I think the current challenges we face, from my point of view, really started with our housing market. And so one of the critical things that we have to find a way to do is to stabilize the housing market, which in turn will increase consumer confidence. Now, consumer confidence will also be supported by job creation. And I think later we'll get a chance to talk about the President's economic stimulus package and the emphasis on job creation there. I think another critical area I would mention briefly is the whole cost of health insurance, because the underlying rate of increase in health insurance in the U.S. has been consuming a significant amount of wage increases that consumers have been getting. And so as we tackle insurance, we have to solve the twin problems of the 45 million U.S. residents who today don't have access to health insurance. They have access to health, but it's in an undisciplined, unstructured, emergency room type of way. And then finally, we have to slow down the underlying rate of increase in healthcare costs by investing in technology that will help us improve quality of healthcare.
Duncan? But what's your perspective? What is the fundamental challenge you see facing the country from a competitiveness standpoint?
Well, given the other panelists, I think I'll just try to narrow my response to where we stand in the capital markets. I think, from my point of view, there's no question that the U.S. capital markets are the most liquid. They're the deepest. They're the broadest. And I think it's fair to say we still enjoy a preeminent position. I'd have to add, though, that I think the competitive advantage we've had has certainly narrowed in the last 5 to 10 years. If you talk to some experts in the markets, they'll tell you it's all because of Sarbanes-Oxley. When we responded to Enron and WorldCom and the like with new reams of regulation, it certainly did make it less attractive for great international companies to choose the United States as their primary venue for listing. And I think there's a chance to get that back on track, but until we reevaluate whether that's really where we meant to go, was that the right medicine for what happened, I think markets like London that have gotten deeper and more liquid over the last decade certainly have narrowed the competitive advantage that the United States enjoyed. So I think, for starters, that has to change. I think when you bring it back to home a little more, the same rules and regulations have also made it tougher for small companies to find their way to the market. If you think about the natural course of events, a startup company gets some seed money from a venture capitalist. They maybe do a few more rounds of funding. They grow. They use their entrepreneurial spirit and hopefully support from the government, and they're able to move forward. And then they grow. They find their way to the capital market. The VCs exit, and that process starts naturally over and over again. I don't think it's just because of the market difficulties the last 3 quarters that we only had one venture capital-backed company find its way through the process. I think there's something broken with that part of the system, and I think we've got to be willing to assess that and think about how we really truly evaluate what the cost of going public is for a small company. I've seen a recent report from some regulators that say we should definitely still have these rules, and let's not exaggerate what it costs. I think if those regulators spoke to some of our smaller company CEOs, they'd find out that the real cost of complying is quite a bit higher than some study will tell you. So I'd mention those things, Michael. Thank you.
Rupert, how do you see the fundamental challenge?
Well, I think, we are, without any doubt, in a period of really great crisis. And as others have stated, when you're in great crisis, there's opportunities for real change. And I know that President Obama understands that. I spoke to him about it and found him fully aware of that. He's got a moment in history now where he won't ever be as popular again, and this is the time to use his political capital. As for the stimulus package, I'm a little bit of a skeptic. I haven't really seen it all yet. It's not been finalized, and it would be wrong for me to comment exactly on its components. But I think that, one of the great changes we have to do in America and face up to and to make us competitive is to look at our human capital. In all the major school systems in America, public school systems, there's about 35 to 40% of children not even finishing high school. They're allowed to drop out. They're not paid proper attention to. If they don't finish high school, they're incapable of really being first-class readers or in maths or anything. They are really being committed to a permanent underclass or even some to a criminal class. I think we're letting down our young people very badly, but I think we're letting down our nation terribly. And we have to face up why. We are spending infinitely more on education than we used to with practically no result. This will be a really great test for the President, because it really means a huge confrontation with the teachers' union, who object to any form of national testing or national standards or work. Well, actually, there are many fine teachers. Don't get me wrong. I'm generalizing. I'm talking about their very, very rich union, which is probably the number one contributor, I would think, to the Democratic Party. So it's going to take courage and it's going to take strength for the President to do something about this radically. And I think this is the moment for him to do that. But really, if America is going to continue to lead the world and is going to be in the forefront, anyway, of the world in the next 30 to 40 years, it must do a lot about educating its younger people. So I'll leave it there now. I can talk about things later.
I think we've got a fundamental human resource issue in the country. We haven't actually made much progress at it in the last 20 or 30 years, despite the fact that we talk about it all the time. We've got a fundamental challenge of healthcare cost and access. Again, we've been talk. We haven't done much about it. We've got our capital markets have been a core strength of the United States, but that advantage seems to be at least potentially eroding and somewhat at risk, notwithstanding even the current difficulties. Ellen, how would you add to that agenda for the United States?
So as I look at what has made the U.S. strong over its history, it has been around innovation and the investment and protection of technology. And I think over the years, that advantage has been eroded some. And I think if you want to revitalize the United States, we have to continue to invest more in technology, in its protection, and in its deployment and moving it out into the marketplace very quickly. You know, it costs millions of dollars for companies to invent, and the protection of that is very important and enables them to really drive that technology out in the marketplace. At the same time, we see in things like alternate energy, where there's a lot of investment as the price of oil's come up. Now that the price of oil's dropped back, that investment seems to be pulling back a bit. And now's the time we have to continue to invest in those alternatives, because we all believe the price of oil is going to go back up. And photovoltaics, and whether it's battery technology, there's just a tremendous amount that the U.S. can bring to bear, but it's going to take focus and it's going to take investment, and we can't, with this recession, get off that track.
And what have we been doing wrong in technology in the U.S., looking back over the last 10 years or so?
I think that, notwithstanding our capital markets, we've allowed more of a short-term focus. And most companies, public companies, because of that short-term focus, have been mostly investing in applied technology, and the basic technology has been left largely to government and universities. And we've seen how that those partnerships have been tough in coming together. They're doing better today. But I think companies need to be investing more in terms of basic research and applied research to continue that.
So, again, another core strength of the U.S. has been this technology innovation engine that has been spitting out new technology and leading to breakthroughs in many fields. That engine may be sputtering a little bit at this point. David, how would you see the challenge, the agenda?
Say, since the U.S. has been the largest economy in the world since roughly 1870, for most of organized history, the last 2,000 years, China was actually the largest economy in the world. The U.S. really took hold as the dominant economy around 1870 and has held it pretty strongly since then. And many people did not think that was such a good thing, and I think many people who came to Davos weren't sure that U.S. prosperity was such a wonderful thing and U.S. competitiveness was such a wonderful thing. And the concept took hold in recent years that many other economies in the world had decoupled themselves, and their success was not dependent on the U.S. being competitive or very strong. I think the events of the last year or so have probably destroyed the notion of decoupling, and I think most people now recognize that if the U.S. is in trouble financially and its economy is not doing well, it's going to hurt the entire world's economy. So I think it's important to recognize that U.S. competitiveness is important for the world's economy to do well, and therefore I think it's important that the U.S. economy be very competitive. And going forward, I don't think there's any one solution that's going to solve a problem. Many of the problems we now face in the United States have been built up over many, many years. The biggest problem I foresee right now is the temptation to say, because the private sector perhaps didn't do everything it should have done and made some mistakes, all of a sudden we should regulate and we should have the government decide what is the best policy in terms of making the U.S. competitive. And I think that could be a real danger. You know, there's a tendency to overreact to problems, and the overreaction often is worse than the problem that was supposedly being helped. So I hope very much that the new administration and everyone else in the United States that's part of solving this problem does not say, well, we need to regulate, we need to say which industries are going to be the ones we're going to save, and we're going to do the things that are going to be pleasing to a Congress or a political body. I think the U.S. Business system works reasonably well. It's obviously have some problems now, but I do think that with some help from the government now, it can get back on its feet and can become the most productive economy again in the world. We should recognize, though, that if the U.S. becomes competitive again, it's never going to be quite as large an economy and as dominant as it once was. After World War II, we were 50% of the world's GDP. We're now roughly 22% and heading down to probably 19%. So the U.S. role going forward in the global economy is going to be much different than it was before. But I still think as a leader of innovation and as a leader of showing people how they can take capital and create ideas and make big companies, it's still the leader in the world. Final point is the U.S. has reinvented its economy for decades. Whatever we did in the 1870s to become the dominant economy changed by the 1890s and by the 1920s, 1940s. We're no longer the largest manufacturer of certain types of products. We're going to reinvent our economy, and we will continue to reinvent it for many, many years. I think it's a good thing. Nobody can decide from the government, though, what the new part of the economy should be. I think the government should not decide what industries are going to be favored. I think the private sector should be allowed to make these decisions and let the private sector move forward without undue government interference.
You know, it's interesting, if you look at the surveys and the data, even going into this period of crisis, the U.S. actually is legendary for having already a lot of regulatory complexity, a lot of litigation cost, and a lot of kind of regulatory intervention, if you will, in the economy. So I guess what you're saying is, boy, if we have that history that's been building up and now we react to this crisis in the wrong way, that will just make that problem worse.
Well, the current zeitgeist, the zeitgeist now in the United States is the government needs to come in to save the private sector. The private sector failed, and the government's now going to bail out the private sector. And once we do that, the cost of that is that we're going to be telling you what to do, and we're regulating you even more. And so I think that's just going to be a mistake. And my hope is that the new administration, the Congress, don't fall for the temptation to regulate and overly regulate what is already, as you point out, a highly regulated system. The great strength of the American system has been to allow creativity to foster and to allow the economy to reinvent itself without the government having an undue influence on it. Many other countries in the world have much more government interference, and I think that hasn't been as good for those economies as our current system has been for the U.S.
I'd add to that, Michael,
sure,
if I may, because
sure.
I think we've talked a lot about that at our own company and with the President's transition team. We've got regulated, transparent markets that actually performed quite well, not just in the United States, but really in almost all developed countries around the world. And now we've got all these off-balance sheet transactions, all these opaque markets that seem to just open and close whenever it's convenient for the participants. So one of the things we've suggested to the President's transition team is it may not require us sitting down and thinking about whole new regulatory regimes. Why don't we first start by trying to apply some of the regulations that we think worked to just different products? And maybe that's just a faster way to bring transparency and then therefore confidence back to the market.
Rupert, do you have a comment?
Yes, I think, well, on a wider scope, one of the main jobs of the government is to reassert itself in the area of protectionism. We must keep markets open in this world. We've seen open markets have benefited everybody, rich and poor alike, particularly poor. And yet, right now, we're seeing a very dangerous move and a mood towards protectionism in many places. Even today, I had two cases. A leading French industrialist told me how the government there, the president there, said, I understand you have to contract, I understand you have to make savings, but don't fire anyone in France. Fire them in the other countries that you have factories. That is straight-up protectionism. Another case, there's a strike in Britain today at a big oil refinery because they're doing some major construction and they've hired 200 Italian workers. Italians apparently are great experts in this particular field, and yet we have thousands of workers going on strike. This is just a popular mood, and the politicians tend to reflect it. If I can mention a four-letter word, you'd have haven't heard here once this week, and it's Doha. We seem to have forgotten that. There is undoubtedly a popular swing back from open markets, and I think that is tragic, and we have to really get out in front and fight it very, very hard.
I would just add on that point that the U.S. has been the country which talks the most about free trade and has tried, I think, to do the most in promoting it. But in fact, we have become, in many ways, the most protectionist country. And we have to resist the temptation now, because of the recession or other problems, to play these political instincts that often people have to be protectionist. In the campaign, the presidential campaign, a lot of protectionist statements were made, and it's my hope that the administration will not follow at least those campaign promises and not hold up some treaties and other things that I think would send a bad signal. Because if the U.S. shows any protectionist signs, it will give everybody else in the world free rein to say, well, look what the United States is doing, so we can do what we want to do in terms of protecting our own economies. And I think it would be very dangerous.
I just want to add to that, if I can, that I think a lot of the rhetoric from President Obama when he was campaigning was very frightening. But already, I think he's showing he's a much more pragmatic person and understands the issues. I just hope that he can control. His bigger difficulty is to control his Congress.
Ron?
Yes, I think one of the things I would stress, I think it's extremely important that we have these open markets. I think one of the things that I've seen that's addressing some of this underlying consumer angst, for example, is in the stimulus bill there is an approach that would help unemployed workers be able to maintain their health insurance. And so as we take into account the fact that in these dislocations people are anxious, to the extent we have retraining, we have ways to help people address health insurance and develop a skill set that they may need to go forward because of the dislocation of their current skill set geographically or to other industries, I think that can give the President and others support for making free trade as important an element of our future growth, well, not just in America, but globally.
Ellen?
No, as we take a look at the stimulus package, we see a lot of words around infrastructure development and energy security, which is all very positive. But as we go forward with that, I think there has to be an element of these new technologies in there. If you think about infrastructure development, our aging public transit systems, there's hybrid electric technology available in buses and in rail, and there's fuel cells available. And that opens up a tremendous amount of new opportunities for manufacturing, for service-related industries, and training workers in these new areas. In the area of energy efficiency, close to 70% of the energy in the United States is used to heat and cool our homes and small commercial establishments. Yet there's no incentive for them to become more energy efficient. So whether it's tax credits so that you really create more of a payback on investments in either photovoltaics or other technologies to create energy efficiency. But there's that whole lower end that really needs to be, from an economic standpoint, needs an economically viable way to invest in energy efficiency. And the stimulus package needs to consider that in terms of whether it's tax credits or whether it's investments in new technologies to really create a much stronger infrastructure.
I'd say on energy efficiency, it's a very important point. Historically, whenever oil prices went high, people said we should have alternative energy, and plans were made, and government got very interested in this, and the private sector geared up for it. And then as soon as oil prices went down, everybody lost their interest in this. The real danger we face in the United States now is that with relatively low oil prices and no taxes on gasoline, and I don't think we're going to have any taxes on gasoline beyond what we currently have, there's a real risk that the alternative energy industry could die again. And so I hope very much that the new president and administration won't let that happen, and we won't fall for the trap of lower oil prices and getting out of alternative energy. Because if we do, we're going to find ourselves in the same problem 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. As oil prices go up again, we will not have the alternative energy infrastructure that we really need.
Well, I want to leave some time for questions and comments from the audience. You see the answer to the question I posed. A resounding no. Is the economic stimulus package on target? Overwhelmingly, our viewers, our listeners say no. So let's kind of let the panel now kind of make their advice to the president. So what would you do if you're President Obama, given this discussion, given the challenges, that's actionable? What is that advice for that new president? Duncan, you want to start us off?
Oh, sure. I'll go first. I'm sure some of this is going to overlap with all the panelists. I just jotted down a few things. Number one, do what we have to keep the talent here. I talk to a lot of small company executives who say to me their most difficult situation is they're in this virtual economy, they're global. They actually can't host their management meetings in the United States because their managers in other countries can't get in for the meeting. So I think let's try to figure out how to make sure that we're open to letting people come in and out, and when they're here to get educated, let's keep the talent here. In the stimulus plan, and I'm with Rupert, I haven't read through it enough to know exactly where it's targeted. I think it seems directionally correct. Let's make sure we're focused on the real economy and small businesses. I think it's in the midst of this crisis, it's tempting to only focus on financial services. Let's make sure we pay more attention to the real economy and small business people, because the history I've studied tells me every downturn in the U.S., it's been the small business engine that's gotten us back out of it. As others on the panel have said, resist the impulses to be protectionist. That would be an unmitigated disaster right now. I really hope globalization is not a casualty of this crisis. I think that would be something we'd never get back. I get asked a lot in my role, what are we going to do to reinstill investor confidence? Wrong question, wrong time. Let's figure out how to reinstill consumer confidence first, and then we'll work our way around to investor confidence later. People have to be focused on the house they live in and can they stay in it, the job they have and are they going to keep it, and the food they need to buy to support their family. I don't think people are sitting at home right now worrying about whether they should buy stocks or bonds. So I think we should worry about them as consumers. We've got to focus on transparency. I think he should enlist and demand, in fact, support from leaders like the people we have on this stage. If we're not ready to step up and lead and be counted and be out in front of some of these issues, then we don't deserve these jobs. And I think, as Ann and others have said, we got to stay the course on energy efficiency. Enough of this Groundhog Day, enough of this deja vu. We've watched this movie too many times. It's time to just get serious about it and push it through this time. Thanks.
David?
I'd say, first, don't try to do everything in 100 days. We have a fetish in the United States that the presidents in the first 100 days are going to do miracles, as FDR supposedly did. Don't worry about the first 100 days, because you're not going to solve all these problems in the first 100 days. You've got 1,440 days left to go. It's going to take at least 4 years to solve a lot of these problems. Secondly, don't give up on bipartisan approaches. You got no Republican votes in the first House passage of the stimulus bill, but don't give up on Republican votes, because I think a bipartisan approach is what the country really needs. Third, go to the country and sell your program. Don't be afraid to go on television. Don't be afraid to explain to everybody why you want these various things in the stimulus bill. The stimulus bill is designed to stabilize the economy, to jumpstart the financial system again, and to do so in an equitable and fair way. But no one bill can do all that. We have to recognize that many of the things in the stimulus package were in Congress before as ideas, and they just hadn't passed before. Now there are enough votes to pass them, and the President will sign it. But these are not by themselves going to solve the problem. We need to have much more in terms of financial system correction, and we'll need another TARP bill on top of the TARP bill that already exists, and some kind of aggregator bank legislation that probably will be needed to solve the financial system's problems, so that the stimulus bill isn't by itself going to solve these problems. And last, I would urge the President to come to Davos at some point. We've never had a incumbent President of the United States, I think, come here, and I think if he were to come here, he would see the dimensions of the economy and see it as not just a U.S.-centered problem. Because when you come here, you realize how the United States is not so dominant in the global economy anymore, and how so many other people in the economy around the world have important things to say. And I think he, probably more than any other president, would benefit from this, and probably he, more than any other president, would be well received here.
Ellen, would you go next, and then Rupert, and then Ron?
Certainly. The stimulus package passed the House. It's going to the Senate. I think it'll probably pass within a couple of weeks. Then the real work starts. The real work starts in breaking it down and getting it out, either it's dollars to the states or dollars to projects, or the IRS working on new tax credits and the like. And we're not going to get it right the first time. And I think that the administration has to be very quick to understand whether a part of it's working or not, and has to regroup and act quickly if it's not. Because, it's not 100 days, it is 4 years, but as you know, in the U.S. government, things can bog down for a long period of time. So I think it's critical it gets broken down into its elements and driven, and very quickly assessed whether it's working or not, and recasting if it's not.
Any particular suggestion in terms of the substantive agenda that the President has to drive?
I think if you look at taxes, and you look, if they enact tax laws, different tax laws quickly, things can move quickly, because then we understand what our benefit is, what our costs are, and we can actually move much more quickly than waiting to the end of the year when we're looking backwards. So I think the quicker they can move on things like that, the quicker industry, small or large, can start taking action.
Rupert?
Yes, I would just say, from what I have seen of the tax cuts, for instance, the idea that everyone gets a check for $700. We tried that not so many months ago, and it really had no effect. And it'll be gone. I think you need some long-term, carefully aimed tax cuts. I don't agree with David. I think we could get a $1 increase in gasoline taxes, and that money could be diverted and used to bring down corporate taxes. Our corporate taxes in America are about the highest in the world, which make our companies much less competitive to those in other parts of the world. But we can all talk about what's wrong. I could tell you so many horror stories that I see, say, in the state of New York and so on. But really, let's remember, in the last 10 to 20 years, the wealth creation in America under the American system of open, free enterprise, and compare it with the wealth creation that's gone on in Europe with a dependent welfare state mentality. I'd be very unpopular for saying this, but the fact is we have gone at least double the rate of Europe in wealth creation. So, we're not doing too badly.
I would add that the private sector is probably going to be flagellated a fair bit, because there's going to be a lot of effort in the United States to blame people for how we got into this economic problem. And there's no doubt some justification in looking for people who made mistakes and helped get us in this problem. But everybody was responsible, and trying to point one industry or one individual, I think, is a mistake. I think the President deserves credit for not trying to focus on how we got into this problem and focusing on the future. But I would urge him to bring some people into his government who've been in the private sector and been in business. While he has a very brilliant cabinet and a very brilliant White House staff, very few of them have actually, if any, have served in the business world or in the private sector or in the investment world. And while they have knowledge of these worlds, I think having somebody at the table on a regular basis who has served in the business world, who has met a payroll, who has built the business, would be helpful as the President listens for advice about how to get the economy going again.
Ron?
Yeah, probably one area I would underscore is back to small businesses. Because I think one of the things that we're at risk of missing is the fact that many small businesses have been financed with non-traditional sources of credit, meaning that they've tapped into their home equity lines of credit on their homes. They've used their personal credit cards for inventory purchases and for payroll. And so as credit has tightened at the consumer level, there's a potential for a disproportionate impact on the small entrepreneurial businesses in the U.S.
The president right now.
Yeah. So I would say that that's extremely important. The final point I would make is healthcare is an incredibly important part in the U.S. We now spend $2.2 trillion. We're on track to spend $4.2 trillion over the next 10 years. We have a uniquely American system that's based on a public-private system where the employers have really been the source of innovation in that system. And I think as we go forward, we have a huge opportunity to apply innovation to healthcare. Information technology has transformed every facet of our society except healthcare. And the opportunity to improve quality and slow down the rate of increase and make healthcare more affordable is an extremely important opportunity that can help all businesses in America become more competitive globally and give our citizens the kind of access and quality that they deserve.
So I think we've had a very rich discussion. It's interesting that some of what you've said is really about the content of what specific policies are set. You know, keep the talent here, resist protectionism, you know, follow through on energy this time, get the tax regime right, consider, you know, gas tax increases. So those are all fairly concrete policy changes. But it's interesting that all of you, in one way or another, have also talked a lot about the process that the president uses to lead over the next period of time. You know, don't give up on bipartisan approaches. Sell what you're doing to the public. Don't get into the blame game. You know, try to really build credibility and build ties with the private sector, who ultimately has to be the one who competes in the marketplace. So I think we've had a rich set of suggestions here for the new president. Let's now open it up and allow those of you who would like to raise a recommendation to do so. And let's focus the open part of this on recommendations, not analysis, not what's wrong, but what is it that you would say that President Obama needs to do right now to deal with this situation?
Someone over in the corner.
Can't see anybody.
It's hard for us to see, so let's just let the microphone person be.
My name is Van Zadelhoff from Holland.
Yes.
I have one strong advice to America. Stop up from now no-recourse loans on housing. And it works in Holland. Very, very good. Recourse loans is much better. Put people on responsibility. It's one day to the other. Just stop it. Not from the past. That's gone. But up from now.
Okay. Couple down here. Again, advice to President Obama.
Yeah, Adam Tambara from Zimbabwe. The major theme at this Davos is that we need to think in terms of global solutions, global responses. So as we make America competitive, we must make sure that we don't make that at the expense of the global responses. So the challenge is, how do you make sure that you make country A competitive, country B competitive, but without undermining the essence of a global response and global governance? Because if we don't do that, then we don't have a holistic solution.
And how would you do that?
I think we need to rethink the whole notion of country competitiveness and emphasize more sustainable global governance systems, sustainable global responses, as opposed to emphasizing how do we make America competitive. What if making America competitive undermines competitiveness in Europe and in Africa? The essence here is interconnectedness of countries, interdependence of communities, and hence the essence of holistic solutions and global responses.
Okay. Certainly from the point of view of the forum and our Global Competitiveness Report, when we use the word competitiveness, we're not talking about a zero-sum game. U.S. wins, France loses, Japan wins, Korea loses. We're talking about building the fundamental productivity of the economy, the efficiency of the economy, which really allows any nation and all nations to improve. So I want to make it clear that the spirit of this session is not about how the U.S. can win at somebody's expense, but how the U.S. can actually get moving in enhancing its fundamental productivity and also hopefully driving and supporting the rest of the world. So other suggestions for the new president?
So, Michael, I'm Robert Stoles from the U.S. I actually have a quick question. Many of us sat here, I guess it was 2 days ago, and listened to Bill Clinton give his nod for nationalizing banks in the U.S. And I was dismayed, of course, at that. But I'm curious if your panel would comment on their thoughts on that.
Any takers?
Yes, I'll take that. I agree with you. I think it'd be a truly terrible thing. We've seen... we saw what happened with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They're meant to be independent corporations, but in fact, the Congress was telling them how to make bad loans and forcing it, and that's where we started this. Or a lot of blame goes there. 6 months ago, we had the collapse of a bank, total collapse of a mortgage bank in Britain, Northern Rock. The government took it over and said it would liquidate it and run it down in an orderly fashion over a short number of years. They're already making public statements telling the board of that bank to make more generous mortgage loans. And once you get politicians running the banks, God knows where it will lead us.
I think that the U.S., the new administration is not interested in nationalizing banks, and they're going to do everything they can to avoid it, and I think the aggregator bank system will try to avoid it. The example often cited about why nationalizing works is Sweden. Sweden in the 90s nationalized its banking system. And Sweden is a wonderful country, and the system did work there, I think. But you can't compare the Swedish banks that were nationalized with the gigantic global banks we have in the United States. They just have much more, their tentacles around the economy than the Swedish banks did, and they're much more global. And I just don't think you can do the same things with the large U.S. banks that was done in Sweden. So I don't think the system is really analogous, and I don't think we're going to go in that direction.
I actually think there's no danger of it. I did hear that Mr. Clinton said that. I wasn't at that session. I think, remember, the government's involved now because they had to be, not because they wanted to be. And I think a lot of the discussions we've had this week is where do we go from here? Okay, they're involved out of necessity. That's fine. Some of the things that David and Rupert are talking about, just here's one reason why it can't happen. Because of the global footprint of a lot of these banks that David was alluding to, whether we mean to or not, it alters the competitive balance in these financial services. I was with a prime minister from one country here this week, and he said, I didn't expect to be the chief executive of all the banks in my country in my spare time, but I quickly realized that once I had helped a couple of banks, it was an all or none proposition. And that's impossible in the United States. That can't be done. He said it was an odd outcome because I went to help two banks who needed it. I didn't help another bank who didn't need help, and deposits started flowing out of that bank into the two banks I was helping because they were viewed now as the safer banks. So we know they're involved. I don't think you can go and take that additional step. I think it would be an unmitigated disaster like some other things we're talking about.
Okay, a couple other recommendations from the audience?
I have one. Hello, I have one over here.
Sorry, we can't see anybody.
I know you can't see. That's why I shot it out.
Go ahead. Thank you.
I would like to recommend to President Obama that he not give up on the idea of a carbon tax. I think that in order to sell the carbon tax to the American people, you need to focus less on the tax itself than on the revenue that comes of it. And the revenue that would be produced by a carbon tax is enormous. The population is not excited about it going into the black hole of government spending, but if you were to write them a check for the total tax revenue divided up by the number of people, send it out in advance of the tax being passed, you would find people would have a big check, They know the tax is coming on energy. They could buy a fuel-efficient car. They could insulate their house. They could do lots of things, stimulate segments of the economy that are actually hurting, and make a good start toward this both environmental and economic stimulus.
Okay, any comments to that?
That may have some merit, but I'm pretty sure the administration isn't going to do that. They're worried about being seen as imposing a lot of taxes, I think, at this point, and I think they're going to defer things like that until the post-Kyoto or the new Kyoto agreement is agreed to, and that gives them some time to breathe, because that's not going to be agreed to for a while.
Over here.
Michael Stutchbury from the Australian newspaper. Touching on the protectionist point, the stimulus packages that are going through both houses of Congress have in them provisions that state that all steel used in the infrastructure spending components must be made in American steel. That is, no imported steel would be allowed in the infrastructure packages. The suggestion come question to the panel is whether President Obama should stake an early claim to free trade by trying to cross that provision out.
That provision is in there, but I don't believe it will survive when the bill is through the conference. I don't think the President is going to make a big statement asking for it to be taken out right now, but I think it will be taken out before it passes, so I don't think it will actually see the light of day in the end. The people who supported it got the political points they wanted by putting it in, but I think they knew it wasn't going to stay in there, and I think the administration recognized it's not going to stay in.
Another one here in the middle. Take one or two more, and then I'd like to give the panel the last word.
Jonathan Rothberg from the United States. I have two specific recommendations for the President. The first is have a research plan as ambitious as Vannevar Bush's that was employed after World War II, and increase significantly research spending because innovation creates wealth. The second, let's open up H-1B visas and make United States' largest import IQ points, because smart people and immigrants create wealth for a nation, and everybody you hire creates additional jobs.
No, I think that the standpoint on innovation and research is absolutely correct. I think you have to marry that with there are a lot of technologies that are in the pipeline around alternate energy and other areas that just need that extra push to get over and to get much more economical so they can be deployed across the country. And I think, we're one of the best educators in higher education, in the sciences, and in engineering, and, we have to be open to all students from anywhere, because that just makes us stronger. It makes your world stronger as well.
Yeah, I'd say that we didn't mention this, but our education system isn't very good up to college. But if there's anything in the United States where we lead the world and we are the most competitive and are likely to stay that, it's in our higher education system. It's the envy of the world, and many people who are come to Davos who are not from the United States have educational degrees from there, and we should encourage more people to come to the United States to get degrees there, because when they go back to their own countries, in the end, it helps their countries to have a good education, but also ultimately helps to make people understand the United States better. I'm just curious, how many people here are not from the United States but have a degree from American University? How many want their children to have a degree from American University? Okay. How many think they should go to medical school now instead of business school?
Yeah, I think it's interesting on higher education, David. I think your point is extremely well taken. And it's kind of little known that in the United States we're actually not making much progress in terms of the proportion of our own citizens that are educated in these great universities that we have, whereas other countries have tended to increase their tertiary enrollment. So, and we have a real access problem. How can people afford higher education? And we're cutting back on the support for higher education just at a time when, we probably need those highly educated people even more. So I think that's clearly a good idea for the agenda. One final recommendation, and then we'll let the panel be the last word.
Come on.
Diana Negroponte, the Brookings Institution from Washington. I'd like the panel's opinion on an energized NAFTA. A NAFTA in which border crossings are doubled, security is improved through technology at the base, a revised immigration package, and that's it.
Any takers?
On NAFTA?
Well, I just say that I think it's vital that we keep NAFTA and expand it and improve it. We have a huge problem looming in Mexico. I think that's the great untold story at the moment. It'll be center stage within a year. You've got a state which is falling apart under the influence of the drug trade, which is all, of course, feeding into the United States. And something has to be done about it. So anything we can do with NAFTA, strengthen, and to help Mexico get itself properly governed and in order would be wonderful. I think that's the first priority, or one of the very highest priorities for our foreign policy.
NAFTA was passed in part because the President of the United States got involved, the other living presidents of the United States. And it was actually President Obama's idea to get the presidents together. President Bush convened them shortly before President Obama took office. And I think it would be a very good idea if, on other trade matters, but on other things, the current President of the United States would involve the former Presidents of the United States, because they have collectively a lot of credibility and they can get things done, just as NAFTA was really passed in part because the former President of the United States got involved and really helped push it through.
Well, let's take our last 3 or 4 minutes and ask the panel to sort of offer a final piece of advice and a final recommendation for how to go forward. Ron, would you lead us off?
Yeah, I would just close by saying I think the President is off to a good start. I think based on what I've seen in the stimulus package, there are things in there that are things that we'd all feel good about, and probably some things that we might not personally agree with. I think fundamentally the focus really is on rebuilding consumer confidence, cleaning up the mortgage challenge we have, which at its root really was bad underwriting of mortgages that ended up being resecuritized and passed up through the system. Restoring consumer confidence means that we really have to get to the point that we begin to hear some good news. And I'm optimistic that the year-over-year comparisons will in and of themselves over time give us a baseline to begin to see that. I think the President should continue to focus on job creation, but really recognize that what we need are public-private partnerships where the private sector does what it's really good at doing and the government helps create an environment in which we can do what we do best.
David?
I think 2 points. President Obama's greatest impact, I think, will be abroad in terms of convincing people the United States is not their enemy. I think the previous administration did some things rightly or wrongly that upset the rest of the world, not just talking about Iraq. And as a result, the United States was tuned out by a lot of people around the world. I think now people are tuning in the President of the United States and tuning in the United States again. I think Barack Obama has great goodwill around the rest of the world to a greater extent than any president in my lifetime has, and I think he should take advantage of it and really recognize that's one of his strengths, and he can get people around the world to support many of his policies, and I think that'll be helpful. Secondly, in the United States, as a symbol of somebody who's come from the modest circumstances he did and rose up to the highest office in the land, he is really an inspiration for people in the underclass of the United States who come from modest circumstances or troubled backgrounds, and I think he's going to do a great deal, be a very good role model for those people in the United States who before really didn't think they could ever rise up to be President of the United States. And I think to the extent that he talks to those underclass and uses himself as a role model, he'll do a great deal for the United States.
Rupert?
Yes, I agree with everything that Ron and David have said. I think that the President is off to a great start, but it's very early days yet. And as I said earlier on, I worry about the size of the stimulus package. Clearly it is right that we must put certain major physical things correct in America, like the electricity grid, like the airports, make ourselves a more efficient, stronger country. But we can't do that overnight. We have been living over our means for 20 years, and we have to come back. There's no good saying, get everything right, get them all spending again. We can't go back to last year or the year before, or we'll head for an even bigger tragedy. I think that one has got to be sober about this and get through it and make sure that we don't have too much unemployment, or whatever unemployment we have goes away to a reasonable seasonal figure where people will all feel better. But they have to get used to the idea that we cannot live and spend in the way we have been doing for 20 years. And that goes for everybody individually. As I said earlier, there's huge wealth has disappeared in the last year. And that's from people. Everybody on paper is poorer, feels depressed about it. They've got to get over that depression. And I think if we try and cure it overnight, we're just going to breed a bigger crisis for ourselves.
Duncan?
Okay. I'm going to defer
Ellen?
to the colleague on my right because I stole her material on the first round. So
You get the final word.
You'll get the final word.
You go first.
I think to Rupert's point, it's taken us a while to get in this mess, and it's going to take us a while to get out of it. And I think that the president, it's not going to happen in one big bang. And so he's got to focus on building that momentum through small wins. And those small wins can come across a broad array of areas. And something as simple as job training in new technologies is part of the stimulus package, so that we're retraining. You just can't open the paper without seeing the large number of job cuts that are occurring. But real training, just not, posting on the internet, but real training in order to get people reskilled for new technologies can go a long way towards building that momentum. It's just one idea.
So you took my material.
Okay, good.
I would say this, and it's going to sound a little too touchy-feely, maybe, but while getting it right is obviously critical, I think one thing we learned watching this man rise from where he came to be the president of the United States, I think we learned that he is one of the best communicators of all time, certainly in my lifetime. And I think what he also showed in his campaign is that his team had a dexterity for understanding the new ways you must communicate with people today to get your message across. It's not as simple as it used to be, and they mastered that in this campaign, and I thought did a marvelous job of that. So my last piece of advice would be play on that strength. Understand that there's a lot of great ideas here that we came up with, hopefully, and that many that the administration will. But then think about how to communicate it out. We can see from the poll you've been taking today, people aren't too sure about this stimulus plan yet. So let's get out there and let's make sure he communicates it. Because if I have one fear, and Rupert hinted at this earlier, I don't think we remember anybody with this high an approval rating. His approval rating in the United States is sky high, and when I travel to all these other countries around the world, it's even higher. So let's keep that in mind. Let's use that to our advantage. But the key is going to be communicating these ideas so people understand what it is we're trying to do and why it's so important. Thanks, Michael.
When you're in a crisis, I think there's certain lessons that have emerged, at least in my experience over the years, as we think of crises in business and government. I think one of them is that in a time like this, leaders need to have a positive agenda. They have to have an agenda which can show people a way that things will get better. Secondly, there needs to be kind of a strategic plan so that the resources and the investment go to the areas of greatest priority, addressing the weaknesses that are ultimately going to be the constraints facing the country. That you need to support restructuring and moving on rather than try to delay or mitigate or ameliorate kind of pain in the short run. It's very dangerous to, if an auto bailout ends up not facilitating restructuring, we're much worse off than we were before. And then I guess the final comment, and this is kind of echoed through what everybody has said, is through communication, through personal example, try to use this opportunity to reach out and bring many people together around the agenda, whether they're Americans from different parties or different walks of life, or whether they're citizens of other countries or political leaders in other countries. Try to use this as a time where people should have a common purpose that's higher than ultimately their narrow self-interest. So I'd like to thank the panel for a very thoughtful discussion. I hope the President listens. Thanks.